This is a map of California. You might notice something very different about this map of California. It may be that again. But for 200 years, and you'll notice this map was done in 1666, and I will keep coming back to that sort of timeline, but basically you will notice it is not connected. This is an interesting moment. There are plenty of people in the United States who think that California isn't connected to the rest of the United States, and it may come this way again. But it is also about an identity. It's about being separate. It's about being part of. But it's also a great story of piracy, and it was being mapped out, and they were raided, and the maps were taken to Amsterdam and then repeated. And then actually many atlases ended up with two maps, one that had California connected and one that had California separate. So it's interesting background to what I'm going to talk about, which is basically California. So I'm going to hold close California in this example. So this is my way of trying to tell you I'm going to kind of hang on to the case study of California, but I am an international relations person by design. John also mentioned the split between theory and practice, and I will literally go zooming up to theory for a bit, and then I will come all the way right back down to some practice in terms of how California operates its international affairs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diplomacy, which we haven't talked about, even though conflict and diplomacy are very closely related. The split that John talked about in terms of that theory practice is in spades part of the study of diplomacy. We talk very much separately about theory and practice in diplomacy. A globalization wave and COVID and change. And I think we also haven't talked about how states evolve and how states develop and how we have seen liquid times. And I really agree and embrace the idea of liquid times because I think that we are living through the next wave of globalization. And part of what I've been studying is how other entities are all scrambling for the global space. They all want to be in that global space. So the cases are California's what I call the vertical axis, and then the UK's multiple geography. I'm hoping, and I think that's part of what John and I were chatting about in terms of this conference, is I'm hoping we can find a way to positive fragmentation rather than what I call the sovereignty of me, which is rather than fragmenting down lower and lower levels of governance, and I'm the only person whose views matter and nobody else's views matter, hopefully we can find a way to get to positive fragmentation. So that's the punchline. The good news and the bad news. I suppose it sounds like a joke, but I have good news and bad news. And they're the same thing. I think the nation state is finally on the verge of collapse that we've been predicting for some time. And what that does to things like conflict resolution, what that does to governance, what that does to the day-to-day life of the people in these systems is a really important and I think big question. So that is an aerial picture of my campus. California state system is the largest public university system in the world. We are sitting on the unceded territories of the Wiyot tribe. I'm going to talk a little bit about tribal sovereignty and inherent sovereignty because we've never reconciled that with what we understand as international relations sovereignty. And for those of you who don't know the great state of Jefferson, I also live in that territory, which is an unrecognized sovereign asserting entity of rural Oregon and Northern California. So basically, this could be the future. We have a group of people who are asserting sovereignty about a territory, mainly because they do not see that either the government of Oregon or the government of California are representing their interests, and that's where a lot of this pressure is coming from subnational entities. I happen to live on the territory of all three of these entities. It makes my life rather interesting and complicated, but it also means that's kind of where I started this research, is California sitting in a very strange place because there are entities all around it, literally, trying to overcome it, go around it, go underneath it, in any way, shape that they can to get their own interests more heard. Good old word sovereignty, you gotta love it. And actually what I find fascinating is how many people want to throw it around. Everybody likes to use it, everybody wants to assert it, nobody wants to lose it, and it's also wrapped up with identity. And I think that that's a really important problem for international relations scholars and international legal people, as well as people dealing with conflict. Because the minute you start asserting this idea, which can be both a noun and a verb, it is something that you have. Again, Richard will love these are the great days of ambassadors and the Peace of Westphalia, but it is a territorially bounded legal entity. So the state of Jefferson says that they have a territory, but they are not a recognized entity. Recognition is, and I was fascinated about the idea of recognition because in one context, it clearly has this I see you, which I tell my students all the time. I see you and I see you. And those are two different levels of recognition. In the international legal sense, who we recognize and who we don't recognize is going to be a really, really important question. And what we are going to say as IR scholars is, do you have sovereignty? Are you recognized? Again, I tell my students, I can go around saying I'm Xena Warrior Princess, but if nobody says, hey, Xena, then I'm actually not Xena Warrior Princess. And that's an important question of how I assert my identity and who I feel like I am. But if you don't recognize me in that space, if you don't see me in that way, then we have a problem. And on the legal side, we actually have this sort of serious problem, right? So, good old-fashioned, there are types of diplomacy and they are reflected in types of governance, right? It's not shocking, completely logical. We have early kingdoms, we have regional empires, we have royal courts, and our diplomatic systems reflected whatever the dominant entity was of the day, right? Is not brain surgery, but here we are at this level. Now there's a threat, there's a theory, there's an idea that maybe we would go to some kind of world empire, we'd have some kind of global entity that we would, that's the big fear for the globalists, right? We would keep going to this big, huge thing out there that we would all lose our sovereignty, whatever. But this is where we are right now, this nation state. Confusingly, we put a bunch of things in a bucket when we started redrawing lines. Interestingly and importantly, they're all made up. All of the identities that we have as nations and nation states, the state of California, the state of Oregon, any country you happen to name in most of the world, is like we just drew a line on a map and called it good, right? So this is artificial. We have created, this is socially constructed reality, but we don't quite know how to back away from that reality because we're now all in neck deep in that reality. And it works because we've convinced ourselves that it works, right? And nobody wants to start picking it apart. You actually talk to a lot of states like Canada who have Quebec, or you talk to Belgium who have already been dealing with subnational entities operating in very different ways within their territory, and they recognize what's happening, and the rest of us who've been all very nation-statey are not quite there. So, Robert Cooper is a British diplomat who went to the European Union in 2002. Just at the moment we were having a big discussion about what to do about widening or deepening the European Union. This is a very traditional idea of how states develop, right? Very linear. We have these centuries, we have an economic system, and we have a model of government that reflects that system, right? So state X, la la la, here we are. And his point was the European Union is a huge sign of something going very global. We have changed our ideas of sovereignty in the European Union, right? But his problem, he says, is we're all living together in the same space. This kind of is complicating things because in fact you have people at very different levels of development, and yet we're all occupying the same space and trying to work out how to coexist, which is a very interesting question. I'll come back to John Gray and the idea of what is our big challenge right now is actually how we deal with the fact the nation state as an enlightenment project may be done. The Enlightenment project, according to John Gray, is done as a project, which also includes liberal democracy, posing all kinds of problems for all sorts of things. But that's basically, the traditional model though is, this is where IR has not been great in many respects, is because it's actually not a stagnant model, right? So there's what we call a transatlantic model. We reference the UK-US relationship. That's the sort of traditional Westphalian model. That's the great powers model. It's bilateral, it's on capacities. And I'll put a note in about realism here. Traditional defensive, offensive realism, I got my PhD 25 years ago, and even then we were talking about realism being dead. So there's a huge paradigm shift, and the idea that that's the only state model out there. But my argument has always been, as somebody who used to write speeches for the US ambassador as well as John was much more fun, but that actually the UK-US special relationship is because they are at the same level of state development. That's why it's special. We can talk about language and culture and identity and stuff, but actually it's because they have the same interests and they have the same role on the global stage. Classic relationship. Then I referenced already the community model. And the important takeaway here is that there's both an international and an international, and we started to try and renegotiate sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean when I give you a piece of my sovereignty? Can I give you pieces of sovereignty? Can I lend you my sovereignty for a while? And what does that mean for mine? Am I compromised by that deal? And I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind, because then we started talking about variable geometry. This is back to the Cooper moment of debate, and we talked about, it's okay, we're gonna have variable geometry. People can be at those different levels of development, and it'll all be fine. Don't worry about it. We're just gonna have variable geometry. And there's lots of different terminology that people used for that, wider versus deeper, the differentiated integration, a la carte. Everybody had their own linguistic take on what that would look like. And yet now here we are at the next phase of the European Union. John mentioned that I went away back to the US for about 10 or 12 years, and I came back, and what's fascinating to me is the whole conversation about the European Union post-Brexit has changed about basically the end of the European project. When I was here at the fall of the Berlin Wall as a young, idealistic American, I was fascinated by the idea that this would be the beginning of this, all these great things were happening in the world. And when I came back post-Brexit, actually I was here for the Brexit election too, the whole tone and tenor about the European conversation has changed. And the project, a lot of people think, is dead. Back to the question of sovereignty, yeah? So here's a model that doesn't get a lot of airplay. And I like to bring it out because I actually think that it's back to the idea of variable geometry. This is more prevalent in Southeast Asia, where territoriality wasn't the thing. You could have these mandalas that would overlap. We could have coexisting power. You would pay me tribute, but you were at the end of a long spoke. I was not trying to control you. I was not trying to dominate you. And in fact, you could be a member of several different mandalas as a little entity out here. And I think this is really helpful because I think it looks a lot like domestic politics. As somebody who did some poli-sci in college, not IR, it's like you have the enemies in front of you and you have the enemies behind you, and it's all about alliances and negotiations. And I think it also helps explain the single issue global politics that we see on things like the environment and climate change. Sometimes you're my friend, sometimes you're not my friend. It's not so binary. And it's not so win-win, lose-lose. It's actually a lot more negotiated. Everything is a negotiation. Everything is about how close and far you are to both my friends and my enemies. So I like to bring it out because I think that's also been coexisting. Cooper's point is super important to keep in mind. All of these things, they didn't go away. Realism didn't go away just because we invented pluralism or structuralism or constructivism or all the other great paradigms we talk about. They all coexist. So you can be a social constructivist and you can be a realist, and trying to have a conversation with each other makes for lots of complicated conversations, right? Because you're just living in a completely different worldview. Your idea of the complexity as a way of approach. And I think also John Burton, who I had the great privilege of living with him and his wife in Australia for a month and interviewing him about human needs theory and systems theory, which helped break the way we teach international relations. It was like, we cannot teach international relations anymore with only the realist paradigm, because that's not how it is on the ground. In his diplomatic experience, not how it works, right? So I think this is a kind of interesting way of capturing some of that. Unbeknownst to the state, who are all busy running around being powerful and trying to run the world, things that are completely outside the state's control are waves of globalization. And again, we've kind of broken them up and we said, oh, look, globalization, it's got like these technology, things happen, and we all have to respond to them. It's not like state X invented the steam engine or the internet or whatever. We all are responding to these waves of globalization. Now, what I'd like to suggest to you is, in fact, what we're seeing right now is basically another wave of globalization. I think the last one has ended. I think we're on to a new wave of globalization. I think that COVID has speeded up that process. And what we have seen over all of this time, I really like this pace layering idea is, also because my dad was a geologist, so I sort of feel like, I understand like when people say, oh, time immemorial, like, my dad's a geologist, please don't say that to me. But the idea of different systems change at different paces. And I think what COVID has helped speed up is the idea that we are now basically what used to be this kind of immediate change. We want things immediately, we want it right now. And it has broken us further in the atomization, the social values atomization. I don't have to deal with you because I can just do it for me. I call it the sovereignty of me. And I think that's what has sort of been happening in terms of what's been going on. as a response, my government at whatever level is not representing me. They do not hear me, they don't see me, they don't recognize me, so I'm just gonna do my own thing. And what's been happening is cities, counties, tribes, ports, all of these people and levels of governance are asserting themselves at higher and higher levels of power, which is what I got into in terms of looking at California, right? So basically, I'm also a consultant for the Kuruk tribe, which is the second largest tribe in the state of California. I've worked in the past for the Yurok tribe, who are the largest tribe in California. And so I see firsthand part of the problems in rural areas, both of tribal issues and rural issues not being heard in Sacramento. So I got very interested in this idea as an IR person. It's like, what is this inherent sovereignty thing of which you speak? This seems very strange. And basically, it is a form of unrecognized sovereignty. You don't have to recognize me, I get to assert it. And what tribes say is, we are actually able to assert our sovereignty, and we don't care if anybody else recognizes it, because we are asserting it. Complicated when you get to the global level, right? So, what's been happening is all of these things have worked out. And right now, everybody's very excited. I don't know, some people may be aware, but there's now, the State Department's just created a subnational diplomacy unit, which is being run by a former Ambassador Nina Hitchigian, who was Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles' Deputy Mayor of International Affairs, who I interviewed for my book. And also the George Washington, the Elliott School at George Washington University has decided that subnational diplomacy will be an area of expertise at the university. They have now created an ongoing course in subnational diplomacy, which I've taught on for the last 2 years. The European Union and the UN are both finding ways to recognize cities in those intergovernmental institutions. So all of a sudden, particularly on climate change, but on a whole host of other issues, cities and counties and other kinds of lower level entities are finding a way to get themselves into the global arena, which is, so far we've all been thinking, that's great, that's more democratic, that's more voices into the conversation. My conversation in California, we've been talking about being a nation state for the last 30 years, right? So Governor Davis was the first governor I could find who actually asserted that, whereas Governor Wilson, Secretary for the Environment, made the observation that it's more like a nation state. Schwarzenegger, you may remember, leaned very hard into this in terms of climate change issues. Governor Brown, I interviewed Schwarzenegger, Davis, and Brown, and I was fascinated because I thought Brown would say, oh yes, I'm very global, I'm very cosmopolitan, and he's like, nah, I don't care about that. I only care about the people of California. I am laser focused on the people of California. I don't care about the global agenda, I don't care about global, I was like, really? I think a lot of people think you are. It seems very curious. And then Governor Newsom was actually the first governor in the first 100 days to make a foreign trip. He went to El Salvador to talk about immigration and see what's really going on in El Salvador that's driving these people to come to the border of California. They, of course, said, we would like some more investment. Could you please give us some inward direct investment, please? And he said, oh, yeah, no, I can't do that because I'm only a governor. See ya. So that kind of didn't go as well as he might have hoped. But basically, that's a bumper sticker, which you see. A bumper sticker in the state of California is we are a nation, not a state. It's like, that seems like a whole different level of conversation. So I got interested in all of this and I said, well, gosh, here's the poor old governor in the state of California. And you've got all these people, these are the actors in Survette Brown, and then you've got people who are not recognized in many different dimensions, but there is a federal and a state law about what we call state-to-state relations with tribes. They are legally required, and yet they still don't get on any of the international committees. They don't have a seat in those committees, but they are supposed to be consulted as a state-to-state relationship. Let me tell you a great story about it. A conversation I had with an Irish diplomat about the Choctaw Nation. Very interesting. Anyway, so here's what I was looking at, and I actually went to all of the diplomats, foreign diplomats in the state of California, the consuls general, and I said, how does this work? What's happening in your embassy? You are the Chinese consul general, your capital city is several hours that direction, your ambassador is several hours that direction, Sacramento's 2 hours up the road. Who do you call? How do you organize this? And what I discovered is that diplomatic structures are looking, I used to also work in PR, a lot more like communication strategies of a corporation. They have decided that they do absolutely have to do public diplomacy with governors. they are absolutely colluding with each other in terms of their outreach to different governors in different states, which is by traditional diplomatic standards illegal. You are not supposed to be lobbying. You are not supposed to be colluding in the state, your host country, but they are, and they have to. This was particularly true under Trump when he was basically telling all the foreign diplomats they could go and stuff themselves. So that meant that a lot of them got pushed further and faster out into the states to try and actually make their case directly to businesses and governors out in the rest of the United States. But it's an interesting question as to how diplomatic structures have been forced to change by the level of importance that they put on what governors are doing. So basically there's a very interesting thing called the California effect, which is basically which Newsom loves. He basically said, yeah, the whole country's following us because we're so cool. And basically I can do regulations all I want because basically the entire country is the 4th or 5th largest economy, depending on how you count, in the world. We can actually make changes for the better. We are going to put our agenda and our normative agenda, our political agenda, out there in ways that are MOUs with foreign countries. They're not treaties. I did ask, when's a treaty not a treaty? And I was told, well, when you call it an MOU, I was like, that's interesting. I'm pretty sure it's still pretty close to being illegal. But how does that work? And the California effect is basically the idea that a big state like California can change lots of other things by just doing it. So basically the California effect is maybe we don't have to worry about it being the lowest common denominator. Maybe we could raise the level. Maybe we can improve things by having somebody show that leadership and force that change on other people. This was noticed actually that's the same thing that happened in the European Union. Again, primarily on climate change and environmental regulation, but we didn't have to chase to the bottom. We could actually try and help other countries within the European Union actually level up. We can improve things by getting 2 or 3 key players to agree and changing things for the better according to that normative agenda. So kind of my question is, my hope is that maybe we could actually work out how the California effect, or the Brussels effect, depending on how you want to look at it, there is protection for the small states and the small entities inside that garden wall. We used to call the European Union the idea that inside that garden space that the other people are kind of manning the patrolling the borders, that in fact we could do good things. We could make this a better place by virtue of having this outside shell. And so my thought question, wonderment is, well, a lot of those smaller countries have been sort of protected by big outside meanie cats because they've been inside the European Union, and maybe we can encourage these small entities to have this global voice and space, but without making the whole thing fall apart. I'm a little worried about it, but we'll see. So sure enough, like so many things, the academics were talking about it, and then, I don't know if you happen to see Macron's speech in April, but he basically literally called it multiple geography. He literally talked about increasing sovereignty while remaining separate. And I thought, here it is, the international piece about how we have a multiple geography. How do we try and think of, literally his words, we're going to create a neighborhood. The European Union will now be a neighborhood, and we will share that identity, but we will still be sovereign and separate, but we'll have a multiple geography. We also see this conversation in the UK. Obviously, there's Wales and Scotland, the devolved entities, but the question is, how do you create that buffer that actually means that they don't want to secede completely? I think the SNP election means that the independence for Scotland is off the agenda for quite some time, but I was fascinated that the second he got into power, he had a visit around the cities and the nations of the country and said, aha, I need to try and work out, is that a realization that he needs to try and make those voices heard? Is it a realization that he needs to understand that he sees them, that he hears them, that he recognizes them? And this is one of my favorite quotes ever. It's just, and it's so UK-ish British, but it is also, and of course John will recognize Stormont and Wales, the cities, Scotland. Interesting question as to what the new House of Lords may look like, and whether or not Starmer has identified the fact that multiple geographies, like Macron, has said, I need to have some solution that's institutionalized for multiple geography. This is a new Europe, and I need to try and work out what that is. And it's about subnational entities. So I guess my big, it's more questions than they are like, this is new work for me. I'm sort of dipping my toe into this side of the water or back on the side, having done I did about 50 interviews for my research. It's in a book, which I can show you. But basically there's subnationalism is rising everywhere. And if we see it in isolation, we're missing the point. I think Gaza and Ukraine are about subnationalism. I think that cities, the mega cities of the world, are on the march. I think that there are a lot of people who feel very warm and fuzzy about it because it's about climate change, but we have no infrastructure. We have no systems. We have no reporting. Los Angeles is doing deals with China that they don't tell Sacramento about. There is no place to report any MOUs that you create. I asked the diplomats, everyone I met said, aren't you worried that when there's a new governor or a new mayor of that city that they'll forget that you did? And say, oh, no, we'll remember. Like, that's going to work really well, I'm sure. So it's a hope. And I think in terms of a conflict idea that we can work towards in a positive way is how do you turn the subnational conversation and debate and people who are studying it and working on it and doing it in the State Department and say, actually, this could be really important for conflict. This can be really important for preventing conflict, which is a John Burton term, which is before prevention is provention, and we need to get further back in the process. So I have more questions than answers, but it's like a high subnationalism is out there, and I think that we should be paying attention in terms of conflict resolution, and all of these states and entities at different levels need different solutions.